Chapter 1. Somewhere near Nain, Labrador, in the 1880s. Hesitantly and with great care, she set the plate of hot stew on the old wooden table. His dark eyes leered at the spot where her outstretched arm had brushed his shoulder. She held her breath and slunk away. He looked to his supper. His arms tensed and his knuckles whitened on the fork and knife he held upright on either side of the chipped plate. "Why is the caribou burnt?" he said too quietly. His teeth gritted and jaw tensed. "Why weren't you paying attention?" Her body flexed to run, but the air seemed to solidify around her, and his stare held her fast. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I thought you liked it browned." "Browned, yes, but not burnt," he roared. With deliberation and drawn-out movements, he laid the utensils down, one by one, as he stared at her. His muscular arms bulged and pulsed as he gripped the edge of the table. Terror was a swollen river cresting upon her. "I'll take it back," she said, almost as if the words could save her. She could change the meat in the black iron pot with other pieces that were not as brown. That should satisfy him. With one swoop of his big arm and the speed of a pouncing lynx, he cleared off the table, pushed back the chair, and landed a blow across her face that whipped her head back and split her lip. She didn't see it coming to brace herself. She lost her footing, stumbled backwards, and tripped in the second chair, which sat in the small two-room sod hut. Its leg twisted and broke under her, and she crumpled, tangled in the wood, against the unforgiving earthen wall. Before she could recover, he grabbed a fistful of her dark hair and pulled her upright in front of him. She clutched the strands to relieve the painful stretched scalp, while using her arms bent around her face to protect herself. He struck her about the head twice more with his free hand before landing an elbow to her midsection, all the while cursing her stupidity and uselessness. He released her, and she doubled over in pain, unable to catch her breath. She scrambled away from him, but became trapped against a dirt-packed wall near the shoddy stone fireplace. She tried to make herself as small as possible to him, under the protection of her arms and legs, in the dimness of the room as he rained down his blows. Then he seized her hair once more and dragged her from the ramshackle shelter she knew as home. Stumps, low bushes, and loose rocks on the rugged path tore at her bare heels, ankles, and calves as he stomped along. As much as she tried, she could neither stand nor right herself. He was going too fast. She clutched her hair to lessen the strain and struck out at him with her other fist. Her arm couldn't reach far enough to land a blow. She screamed in agony as she tried to keep up, but there was no reprieve. It only angered him more. She was dragged up across the headland to the edge of the cliff, where he stood her on the precipice of death once again. She thought it must be 200 feet down to the rocks. But after almost a year, this view didn't intimidate her. She'd become accustomed to it. She thought back to how terrifying it had been the first time he hauled her to this bluff. That time she'd been sure he was going to fling her over. She flailed and screamed and begged and cried and said she was sorry, though for what she did not know. When he was sure she was sufficiently frightened, he took her back to the sod hut. He always took her back. Then he carried on with whatever he was doing as if nothing had happened, reassured she was discontented in the cruel entrapment. She didn't quite know how to deal with the beatings. Sometimes she would fight back, and sometimes she would try to hide. There were times she held her tongue to the point she believed she'd forgotten how to speak. She silently spewed her hatred for him behind his back, but when she was alone, she would tell the trees or the grass or the birds how much she hated him. When she tried to leave, she'd gotten too cold or too wet or too hungry. The wilderness, her solitary friend, continuously betrayed her. She'd come to believe she deserved what he doled out. He reminded her often that she should be grateful he was a good provider. But when he went fishing or hunting, she prayed he would not come home. She'd be left alone. She didn't know if that would be harder if women knew how to survive. But there were times she thought it couldn't be as hard as things were now. Ezra, the man born to a mean white fur trader and an Eskimo woman, had a reputation like that of his father. He had no care for the law, nor for his wife. His mother had been brutalized by his father, who ran off after she disappeared. Ezra scrounged around from family to family for food and lodging in the settlement on the outskirts of the Moravian mission in Nain. By the time he was 13 years old, he was all but banished because of the cruelty he showed to both the children and the animals in the village. He was given food when he was hungry, but he learned to depend on his wits and hunting skills to make him an independent, anchorless sort with regard for nobody. His brutality was remarkable, and most people steered clear of the mean man he'd become. But unlike them, she didn't have a say in steering clear. In flights of fancy, she wondered if there was something different. From as long as she had memories, she was hiding or running away, all the while listening to screams and pleadings. She understood that things were the same for her mother. She supposed it must be like that for all women. If it weren't, then somebody would undoubtedly have helped her mother, or would help her. But no one would interfere with a man's business. She often blamed herself for her mother's death. She stood up to him. She stood up to him for her, so she wouldn't be traded at 15 years of age for a kental of fish and a bottle of cheap distilled whiskey. People were afraid of him too. No one stopped her father, a man's business. But she was Ezra's wife. The same business was given out to her. The last time she went to the general store, she had heard the chatter inside. But when she entered, a hush came over the entire place. Mr. Making motioned for her from behind the counter, and the others shuffled aside to let her pass. No matter who or how many were waiting to be served, or for what reason they were there in the store, there was a whispering and a knowing. No one wanted to be responsible for what would happen if she were delayed. A servant of hopelessness, she would have welcomed a delay, a kind word or a smile. The beatings happened anyway, but her isolation would have been lessened and her desolate spirit lifted. Now here she stood, waiting to be dragged back to the house once he saw she was terrified enough and remorseful enough for her failings as a wife. Her future was in his grasp, always in his harsh grasp. Just push me, she thought. A fish hawk screamed from the overcast sky. Then something came over her. Her throbbing face mellowed, her breathing calmed, the sting from the cuts, scrapes and scratches about her legs and feet eased. The soothing breeze tugged at the long black tresses ensnared by the drying blood on her temple and lips. The grass where she stood seemed to paint itself several shades greener, and the water below several shades bluer. She looked down at the rocks. She silently pondered the remnants of her miserable life that smeared clouded pictures across her mind. Not one recollection was a good one. Not one made her smile. The ocean, pulsating, mesmerizing, and soothing, summoned her as its frothed lips salivated and drummed on the rocky shore. Its voice was deep and turbulent and welcoming. She stopped fighting him. Sensing the change in her, without care, he slung her over the edge. She didn't look back. The fishhawk shrieked once more as its steep dive matched her own. The rocks welcomed her into their granite bosom, and the sea devoured her. Once the ocean was finished with her, the waves spit her ashore near Nain 4 days later. The community was riled and demanded action for the murder of the young woman. A few of the brothers from the mission confronted Ezra, but there was no consequences for his actions. The good Christians of the settlement all gathered for the service. She was buried in the community graveyard, a scrap of wood carved with the name Ruth Tactos served to mark her final resting place. Ezra watched from the trees in the hillside. There was a somber yet harmonious chorus of voices in the chapel. When the people left, he did too. He grinned. A man's business.